Hi everyone. In this presentation, we are going to be talking about Lesson 1 and Lesson 2 in your medical terminology book. So some objectives for this lesson is to identify origins of medical language parts and combining forms, build, define, translate, pronounce, and spell terms, identify abbreviations, identify body structures and the terms associated with those structures, use medical language, and recall knowledge of word parts, medical terms, and abbreviations. So if you guys haven't discovered this already, I always like to bring in what I call the with 'em. What's in it for me? What's in it for you? You guys want to know, why does it even matter that we're learning this crazy language? And the reason is because it's the language that we use in the healthcare field, right? You go to Japan, it's helpful if you know Japanese. You go to Mexico, it's helpful that you know Spanish. Can you navigate those countries and not know the native languages? Yes. And so, for all intents and purposes, you could navigate the healthcare field and the operating room if you didn't know this language. However, it is going to make you extremely successful the better you are at speaking this language. And the vocabulary of medical terminology has been developed over time, right? And that started out with the ancient Greeks, who were among the first to study and write about medicine. And then the Romans wanted to get in on the game. And so then we get this combination of Greek and Latin words. And these words are hooked together in certain ways to give us our language. They're like the building blocks of medical terminology. All right, so again, why are they used? Well, if we think about what the reasons why they are used, we can kind of apply this to why is any other language used, right? It's for communication. So when we use medical terminology, sometimes it doesn't seem like it helps us. It might be easier to just say inflammation of the bone and joint instead of saying osteoarthritis, especially if we're not familiar with those word parts. However, it does help facilitate communication and make it a bit easier. And so we refer to that as economy of words. We can say one word instead of having to say 6 or 10 words. And then for accuracy's sake, so using medical terms allows us to be more clear, more concise, and it's utilized across the board. So if you are going to go to a medical program in Mexico or in Japan or in China or wherever, they are still going to be using these same terms. Okay, so let's dig into this. Now, medical terminology, like I said, is kind of a building block language. So terms are built from various word parts. Like we said, Greek and Latin origins are these words, and they can be translated literally into their meanings. And so here's an example of one, which is arthritis, right? The arthro is one part and itis is the other part. Arthro meaning joint and itis meaning inflammation. So inflammation of the joint, right? We can translate that literally to figure out the meaning. Now, there are some terms that are not built from word parts, okay? Word parts meaning there's a root, a suffix, which is an ending, a prefix, which is a beginning, and some sort of interesting combining vowel to make it a little bit easier for us to pronounce the word, right? But some, and those words we can break down. It's easier for us to get to the meaning if we know those word parts. We can kind of break them back into their individual parts, and we can translate those literally. However, there's some words that we can't do that with, and the one that we're looking at here is Alzheimer's disease, right? So the book refers to this as an eponym, and an eponym is a term that's named for a person or place. And as you can see here, Alzheimer's disease is an example of that, and it's named after the first person to identify the disease. Similar is West Nile virus, which is the first geographical location that the West Nile virus was located. So sometimes we can't break these down into their constituents, and so that means there's a bit more memorization that has to happen there because we can't reason it apart. All right, in addition to that, there are also acronyms, and we're familiar with acronyms. They are like a string of letters, right? And they represent specific words in a specific order. So an example of an acronym is one that you see here, which is MRSA, right? And it kind of gives us a word to pronounce, right? We don't say MRSA, we say MRSA, which is methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. And Staphylococcus aureus is a organism that lives on our skin. It's a common organism that lives on our skin. And we refer to it as an opportunistic microorganism. So that means it just lives in harmony with us until we get a scratch or a scrape or a cut or wound. And then if the situation is right, it can cause an infection or something of the sort. Now, there's a certain strain of Staphylococcus aureus which is methicillin resistant, and what that means is methicillin is a type of antibiotic that used to be effective for treating Staphylococcus aureus infections. However, there are resistant strains now. You can think of it like this. Let's say last summer you had weeds in your yard. All right, and you bought some Roundup and you went and sprayed them and they died. Awesome. So then the next season, the weeds come back again. This summer, they're there again. So you dig your Roundup out of your garage and you go out there and you spray them and they die. Well, let's say only 3/4 of them die. Well, you put the Roundup back in and another season goes by and you have more weeds and you spray them. But this time you notice a lot of them don't die, right? They've developed a resistance to that weed killer. Now it's more like, they're like, bring it on, right? I want to drink this. This is delicious. And so similar things can happen with microorganisms, and that's why it's important that we take all of our antibiotics. But that is the story for another day. Suffice it to say that acronyms are used very frequently in medical terminology. Another example would be a laser, and there's tons of examples. But the book uses laser as another example, which is an acronym. And for a long time, I never even knew this, but it stands for light amplification by stimulated emission of radiation, which is a lot easier to say laser than it is to say that mouthful of weird words. All right, moving on with terms not built from word parts. There's also modern and technological language, and these are terms that are derived from the English language, such as nuclear medicine scanner, right? Or magnetic resonance imaging. And then we get to an acronym, right, for that, which is MRI, which is a type of X-ray, basically. All right, so if we are going to use the Lego building blocks of medical terminology, there's 4 word parts that we need to talk about. And the first one is the root. All right, the root is the core of the term. So this gives the fundamental meaning to the word, and all medical terms have at least one root word. Now, the next thing is the suffix. And the suffix comes at the end of the word. It's attached to the root word, right? And it provides additional information or modifies the meaning. Now, not all terms have suffixes. Now, let's talk about the prefix. The prefix is going to be found at the beginning of the word or attached to the front of the root word. All right, and it provides additional information as well, similar to the suffix. And again, not all medical terms have prefixes. So all medical terms have at least one root word. They could have more, but not all terms have a suffix and a prefix. Excuse me. And the last thing we need to talk about is the combining vowel. And the combining vowel, which is typically an O, not all the time, is going to be placed between two root words and between a root word and a suffix if the suffix does not begin with a vowel. Take arthritis, for example. We don't say arthrotis or arthroitis because itis starts with a vowel, and that is a suffix. So we would drop the O from arthro, and we're going to look at this, so don't worry. And then we would just stick itis onto that root word, and we get arthritis, inflammation of the joint. Okay, so again, the combining forms are the root words, and they're the core of the word. Here's an example. Oncologist, okay? Here we have the combining vowel of O, and we have onco and ologist, which are root words. The combining vowel in the example oncologist is the O. Remember, the reason for this is it just makes it easier for us to pronounce the word. Okay, it makes it flow a little bit better. And, we look at the rule. Between a root word and a suffix, if the suffix does not begin with a vowel, we're going to add an O. But ologist does have an O, and onco also has an O. Okay, so we're going to stick those two root words together. So, can you have more than one combining vowel in a term? Yes, you definitely can. And here's a couple examples of that. One is electrocardiogram, and you can see that there are two O's. All right, two combining vowels that are sticking these word parts together. And then the other one is otorhinolaryngology, right? And then there's a couple O's that are serving as our combining vowels as well. So other combining vowels, so we already said that O is the typical one, but there are a couple exceptions. And so sometimes we use E and sometimes we use I. So the top example you see here is cholecystitis, which is inflammation of the gallbladder, and then quadriplegia, which means four limbs being paralyzed. Now, let's talk a little bit more about the suffix. Remember, the suffix is attached to the end of the root word, and it provides additional information or it modifies the meaning of the root word, right? Not all medical terms have suffixes, all right? So let's look at the word oncologist, all right? That is an example. Now, a prefix. The prefix, again, similar to the suffix, but it comes before the root word. It does the same job. It provides additional information and modifies the meaning. Again, not all terms have prefixes. And this one here is metastasis. And metastasis refers to the movement of some sort of substance from one area to another. We usually use the word metastasis to refer to cancer when it has moved or migrated from the initial tumor to another organ or something like that, another body system. All right, so using word parts to build terms. So here we have intravenous is our word, and intra is our prefix. Vene is our root word. It means vein, and ous means pertaining to. So, I forgot to mention intra means within. So when we stick those together, we get the prefix plus the root word plus the suffix. We get a meaning of intravenous being pertaining to within a vein. Now, when we decode these words, we usually start with the suffix or the end part, and then we circle back to the beginning part. So you can see ous, pertaining to, then we go back to the initial part and then decode the rest from left to right. So pertaining to, within a vein. Another example, osteoarthritis. Oste meaning bone, o is our combining vowel, and then we stick another root word, which is arthro, which means joint, and then itis means inflammation. So again, we start at the end with itis, which is inflammation of a bone and joint, then we circle, or inflammation, and then we circle back to bone and joint, reading left to right. So we also use terms to identify body structures. For example, we've probably all heard of the word cell. A cell is a basic unit of all living things. It's the smallest little thingamabob in our body, right? The human body is composed of trillions of these little guys that have various jobs to do, and they might look a little bit differently as well. Right? So the cell is the basic unit, and then if we were to zoom out a little bit to the next kind of biggest structure, we would talk about tissues. Now, tissues are a group of similar cells. They're a collection of them, and they perform a specific function. Take, for example, the myocardium. The myocardium is the heart muscle. It's the tissue that makes up part of the heart organ, right? So the myocardium is made of little tiny cells, and those cells adhere together to form that tissue of the myocardium. And then if we zoom out a little bit more from the tissue, we'll see the entire organ, which would be the heart in my example. All right. And then when we have a collection of organs, that makes up a system. All right, so if we're looking at the heart, the veins, the arteries, that makes up the circulatory system. Now, what else do we have? We have muscle tissue, and muscle tissue, again, like my example of the myocardium, is composed of cells, and their job is to contract. That's what keeps our heart beating, which is super awesome, or allows me to pick up my coffee cup because that's super important. And it usually produces movement. Now, some of those muscles are involuntary, like my heart. I don't have to think about it, and thankfully it keeps beating and it keeps me alive. But if I need to get a drink or get ready in the morning or go for a walk or any of those things, those are voluntary things that I'm telling my body to do it. And sometimes that's subconscious. We don't really think about it, but we think about, I need to pick up my cup, and so our muscles perform that action for us. And then nerve tissue works in conjunction with the muscle tissue, and it is found in nerves. And nerves make up the brain and the spinal cord, and there's a bunch of peripheral nerves as well. And the nervous tissue is responsible for coordinating every single movement and action in the body. Super amazing. if we look a little closer at different types of tissue besides muscle and nervous, there is connective tissue. Now, connective tissue is that stuff that keeps us from like falling apart, right? It keeps our forearm bones connected to our humerus. It keeps our humerus connected to our glenoid in our shoulder joint, right? So that connective tissue is a tough fibrous tissue like tendons and cartilage and ligaments, right? And then blood is also a connective tissue too, which in my mind always seems a little bit strange, but it's categorized as a connective tissue. And then we have our epithelial tissue, and this is what makes up our skin and our membranes. So all the skin that you look at and you see on your body, that is epithelial tissue. There is the epidermis, which is what we see, and then a deeper skin tissue is the epidermis, and then we have various membranes that line our body cavities and our organs. Now, let's talk a little bit about the different cavities. Now, the cranial cavity pertaining to the cranium, right, or this big thing that sits on top of our neck, that is the cavity that holds our brain. Right? And then we have the spinal cavity, which houses the spinal cord. So we have this magnificent brain, and off from that, there's a stem, a brain stem. And that stem turns into the spinal cord. And off from the brain and the spinal cord are all of these amazing little structures called nerves, right? And that's what controls everything in our entire body. So the brain and the spinal cord, they're the bee's knees, right? And then we have our thoracic cavity. Now the thoracic cavity is, if you put your hands on your ribs, right, it's everything that's inside those ribs, all right? That includes the heart, the lungs, part of our esophagus, our trachea, our bronchi, which the trachea, bronchi, and lungs, they're all connected together and they help with our breathing. And then part of the aorta, which is the biggest artery that we have in our body, also lives in the thoracic cavity. It does traverse down our body, so it does live in the abdominal cavity as well, but part of it is in the thoracic cavity. So the thoracic cavity contains the heart, aorta, lungs, esophagus, trachea, and bronchi. Now, a couple more cavities, and these are kind of attached to one another, and that is the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. And a lot of times we will refer to it as the abdominopelvic cavity. And the abdominal cavity, we're talking about, around our belly button and up to our diaphragm, right? Our diaphragm is basically kind of located at the bottom of our thoracic cavity, the very top of our abdominal cavity. And in there we have all kinds of interesting goodies like the stomach, the intestine, the kidneys, the liver, the gallbladder, the pancreas, the spleen, and the ureters. And then in the pelvic cavity, which is the very lower part of the this abdominal pelvic cavity, we have the bladder and the reproductive organs like the uterus and the ovaries, and then also part of our intestines, part of the small intestine, the large intestine, the sigmoid colon, and the rectum also live in the pelvic cavity. So let's take a look at what that looks like. So here's a good visual for us. We have the cranial cavity, and then we have the spinal cavity or vertebral column or cavity. You can see that's all kind of that orangey color. And then if you look at the purple area, that is our thoracic cavity, lungs, heart, esophagus, bronchi, all those fun things. And then we kind of see the pink color is our abdominal cavity. The diaphragm separates the thoracic and the abdominal cavity, and that's where we find most of our digestive organs. And then very low in that abdominal pelvic cavity is the pelvic cavity, and that, like I said, contains the urinary bladder and the uterus and the ovaries, part of the intestines as well. All right, so the body is broken up into a variety of systems. So remember, we said the basic units are cells, then tissues, then organs, then organ systems. And these organ systems, sometimes we call them body systems, and there's a whole bunch of them. The first and foremost one that your book talks about is the integumentary system, and that has all kinds of fun stuff like skin, hair, nails, sweat glands, oil glands, hair follicles, nerves, those kinds of things. But the integumentary system, when we talk about that, you want to think about your skin. It's your body's first line of defense because it covers and protects our body from the outside environment. All right. The respiratory system, that's what helps us to breathe. So anything that when we take a deep breath, right, we're using our nose, our mouth, our trachea, our bronchi, and our lungs. And then the urinary system, right? That's the kidneys, the ureter, the bladder, the urethra. That system helps to filter out wastes, but also hold on to some things. If we need salt, if we need more potassium, the kidneys regulate all of that. And there's a variety of hormones that play into that as well. But super amazing. Thank you, kidneys. Now, the reproductive system, that consists of female reproductive system and male reproductive system. Now, in the female reproductive system, we have things like the uterus and the ovaries and the fallopian tubes and the vagina. And then in the male, we have testes, vas deferens, prostate, and the penis. All right, and so this is how these structures are amazing because they help us reproduce and have little ones and propagate the species. Now, the cardiovascular system is composed of the heart and the veins and the arteries, and its job is to transport stuff around our body, whether it's nutrients that we need, oxygen that we need, or waste that we need to get rid of. It can drop carbon dioxide off in the lungs, and it can drop other waste products off at the kidneys to be filtered out. Now, the lymphatic system kind of works hand in hand with the cardiovascular system, but it also is what provides our immunity. And a lot of the fluid from our blood that gets deposited into the tissues gets picked up by the lymphatic system and dropped back off into the circulatory system for recirculation. So the lymphatic system consists of something called lymph, which is that clear fluid that I just spoke about. Lymph nodes, which are like these little bean-shaped guys that are distributed along the lymphatic vessels, and they're like amazing little filters that help filter stuff out of that lymphatic fluid. And then we also have some organs that are considered lymphatic organs, like our spleen and our thymus. All right, coming in to the home stretch here, just a few more body systems to talk about. Our digestive system, which sounds pretty self-explanatory. We need to eat nutrients, right? And we eat that in the form of, whatever, pasta, celery, chips, candy, all right? And so for that, we use our mouth and our throat and our esophagus, also our stomach and our intestines, and there's some accessory organs as well, like the gallbladder, the liver, and the pancreas that all help to aid in digestion, secrete enzymes to help us break down those macronutrients of the hamburger into these micronutrients that can be utilized by our cells. Okay, it also works to eliminate waste as well. Now, the musculoskeletal system, we're talking about muscles and bones. Musculo meaning muscle, skeletal meaning bones, and that also includes that connective tissue that helps to hold our bones together, like ligaments and tendons, and then the little cushions that are in between, like the meniscus and the coverings on the ends of the bones, which is referred to as cartilage. So the musculoskeletal system helps us to maintain this upright posture that we have, and it also helps to provide movement of our bodies, and it also helps to protect vital organs when we're talking about the skeletal system. Now, the nervous system, again, consists of the brain and the spinal cord and all of those nerves that are running off from those structures. And again, it helps to coordinate the activities of the body. It also helps us to sense our environment. If I touch the stove and it's hot, without even my brain having to think about it, there's going to be something called a reflex arc that's going to cause me to pull my hand away really quickly, right? Because it's hot. So it allows us to sense our environment. And then last but not least is our endocrine system. And the endocrine system is a collection of organs that secrete hormones that are like chemical communications for our entire body. So some examples of that: the pituitary. The pituitary gland is located in the very center almost of the brain, kind of right behind the nose. If you were to like reach in, it would be right there behind the nasal cavity, and it secretes so many hormones, like to regulate growth and to stimulate puberty and to tell us to hold on to water or to let water go. The thyroid is really instrumental in maintaining our metabolism, and then the thymus, helps with growth and development, but then begins to atrophy as we get older. And then, as we reach the ages of like 75 and 80, like the thymus is almost just like this very fibrotic, really not functioning kind of organ. The adrenal glands, responsible for fight or flight, among other things like regulating kidney function. And then the pancreas, which is instrumental in helping us to digest our food and also helping us to take up glucose into our bodies. And here's a look at all of the players that we just talked about. So you can kind of see what is involved with each of those. Okay, so let's talk about some different word parts. So in lesson 1, and you can find this particular chart on page 8 of your textbook in lesson 1, but it starts talking about some specific word parts, and this is just a reminder that these are considered root words, right? They're the core of the word and the fundamental meaning. And then we can stick on the prefix or the suffix that's either going to add to the meaning or clarify the meaning or change the meaning in some way. Okay, so here we're looking at carcino, which means cancer, like carcinogen would be something that causes cancer. Right. Cyto, which is cell, epithelio, epithelium, histo, which is tissue, lipo, which is fat, and myo, which is muscle. And some of these sound like they're words, right? Like epithelio, that's pretty easy because it sounds like epithelium. But some others, like histo, that doesn't sound like the meaning of the word. And so sometimes it takes a little bit more work to get those into our memory banks. Additional word parts: neuro, which means nerve, onco, meaning tumor, patho, meaning disease, like pathology, right, is the study of disease. Sarco, which pertains to flesh or connective tissue. Sarcoma would be a good example, right, of a fleshy tumor or tumor of the flesh. And then viscero, like visceral, which would be pertaining to the internal organs. Now let's look at some suffixes that we might be able to connect with those word parts. Suffixes such as al, which means pertaining to, or genic, which means producing, originating, or causing. What about logist, like neurologist, right? That would be one who studies the nervous system, right? Or neurology, right? Logy, the study of the nervous system. What about the ending oid, O-I-D? That means resembling. So the word dermoid means resembling the skin or resembling the dermis. Oma, like sarcoma, like I mentioned before, would be a tumor of some kind. Neuroma would be a tumor of the nervous tissue. Plasm is a growth or substance or formation. And then stasis means control or stop. Now, some common prefixes that might be added to those root words might be meta or neo. Now, meta means beyond and neo means new. So we could build a word like metastasis, right? Or neomyosarcoma, right? Some new tumor growth of the muscle and the flesh. So hopefully, as we talk about these different root words, prefixes, and suffixes, you can see how they are used as building blocks to create the meaning of whatever the word is. So if we can break that down into its parts, we can define it. And on a test, if you have a medical term that can actually, breaks into word parts, maybe you only know a couple of the parts, but you don't know the third one. A lot of times that's enough to get you to the answer that you need, right? And it's also important to practice saying these out loud, right? So there's some opportunities in your textbook to just use those pronunciation keys and get used to saying these words, because saying them is going to help you with the communication that you need to deliver in the operating room when you're using medical terminology. So again, we talked about the combining vowel, and O is the one that's typically used. And again, this is to facilitate communication or the ease of pronouncing the word when you're saying it. So let's look at a couple examples. So one we've already seen before, carcinogenic. Okay, so carcin or carcino is the root word. The O is the combining vowel, and then genic is the suffix pertaining to a new cancer. Carcinogenic, pertaining to a new cancer. Or the example of sarcoma, like I gave before. Sarc being the root word and oma being the suffix. Here we have a couple more examples. Neuroma, and cytoid. So neuroma, neuro is the root word, oma is the suffix. So we combine those, we get neuroma, which is a tumor composed of nerve tissue. Remember, we start at the end and then we circle back to the front of the word and decode from left to right. Cytoid, cyto is the root word, oid is the suffix. Again, we start at the end of the word, which is oid, which means resembling, and cyto means a cell, resembling a cell. So here are some examples of medical terms built from some word parts. Some we've already gone over, carcinoma, cytoid, cytology, and epithelial. Take a second to practice saying those. Pause the lesson and practice saying these out loud to yourself using the pronunciation key. Additional terms that you can practice and take a minute to say and define: epithelioma, a tumor pertaining to the epithelium, right? Histology, the study of tissues. Lipoid, resembling fat. Lipoma, a tumor of the fat or a fat tumor. And metastasis, right, which is that movement of something from one site to another, and we typically use it to refer to cancer. Additional words like myoma, neoplasm, neuroma, oncologist, and oncology. Again, myoma, oma meaning tumor-like, myo meaning muscle, okay, a tumor of the muscle. Neoplasm, that's going to be pertaining to a new growth, right? Or neuroma, a tumor of the nervous tissue. Oncologist, one who specializes in the study of cancer, right? And then oncology, which is the study of cancer. Additional terms here: pathogenic, which means pertaining to a new disease. Pathologist, which is one who studies those diseases. Pathology, which is the study of those diseases. A radiologist, one who studies radiography, right? Or imaging, x-rays, those kinds of things. And then radiology being the study of those imaging processes. A couple more here for us: sarcoma and visceral. So take a second and think to yourself, what does sarco mean? What does oma mean? Sarcoma, a tumor of the flesh, right? What about visceral? Visceral pertaining to, AL, pertaining to the internal organs or the viscera. So like I said, there are words that are not built from medical terms, and some of them are listed here for you. One example, or some examples: benign, which means it's not malignant or non-reoccurring. Biopsy, removal of living tissue to be viewed under a microscope for diagnostic purposes. Chemotherapy, treatment of cancer by using pharmaceuticals. Diagnosis, this is to identify a disease or the process of identifying a disease. An infection is an invasion of pathogens into the body tissues. Inflammation, this is a localized protective process or mechanism that our body uses in response to injury or tissue destruction or some sort of invading organism, right? And it's characterized by heat, pain, swelling, redness, those kinds of things. Malignant, that means tending to become progressively worse, possibly resulting in death. And we use this to refer to cancers if they're malignant. Prognosis, that's the prediction of a possible outcome of a disease. Additional terms: radiation therapy. This is a procedure that they use to treat cancer. And radioactive substances, x-rays, and other forms of radiation are used to destroy the tumor cells. If someone is in remission, that means they have a lessening or an absence of signs or disease. And again, we oftentimes use this to refer to someone that had cancer, but there is no active cancer in their body at the time. We say they're in remission. Now, Staphylococcus and Streptococcus are microorganisms. Staphylococcus, I mentioned before when we talked about MRSA and Staphylococcus aureus. We can break these words apart, and coccus is pertaining to the shape of the bacteria itself, which is round. If a microorganism is a coccus shape, it is a round shape. Now, staphylo refers to how they group together or don't group together, depending on. Well, staphylo means like a cluster of grapes, and I like to think of staphylo, what helps me remember it is staff meeting. If we're in a staff meeting, we are clustered together as a group, right? So that's how I remember staphylo. Streptococcus, again, coccus referring to the shape of the microorganism, and strepto referring to how they link or group together. Now, in this specific word, strepto means chain, okay? And what helps me to remember it is I think of strept as strip, and the words are really close together, so that helps me to remember that strepto is like a strip or a chain of round bacteria, Streptococcus. All right, let's talk about a few abbreviations. BX is the abbreviation for biopsy, whereas CA is the abbreviation for cancer or carcinoma. Now, oftentimes when we refer to chemotherapy treatments, we shorten that to just be chemo. DX is the abbreviation for diagnosis, whereas laboratory, a lot of times we refer to that as the lab, right? And we say this, we have the Surg Tech lab, the OR lab at school, right, on campus. And then metastasis or metastases, which is plural, a lot of times we shorten that to METS. Continuing on with some abbreviations, PATH is short for pathology, whereas PX is abbreviation for prognosis. Sometimes we might refer to staphylococcus or staphylococci, which is just the plural form of staphylococcus, as staph. And you might have heard these terms used before. So-and-so had a staph infection. So-and-so had a strep infection, right? We probably all of us have heard the diagnosis of strep throat. Well, that's what they're referring to, is the tissue of the throat or pharynx has become invaded by this streptococci bacteria. And we refer to that as strep. And then the last one here is radiation therapy, which we abbreviate as XRT. So now we're moving away from our introduction to medical language, body structure, and oncology, and now we're going to focus on directional terms, positions, and imaging. Now, I didn't put the objectives for this lesson, but the objectives are going to be the same. We're going to build, translate, pronounce different terms built from word parts, root words, prefixes, suffixes. We'll also learn some new abbreviations and hopefully come away knowing more medical terms. All right, we're going to be adding more to our medical terminology prowess, if you will. So let's get started with that. So some word parts that are important for us to know when we are familiarizing ourselves with directional terms are some that are listed here. Now, these are important because the surgeon is going to use these terms in the operating room to refer to the front of the body, or the tail end of the body, the head of the body, a part that's farther away from the torso of the body, so on and so forth. So it's important that we understand if the surgeon says, I need you to, I'm trying to think of a quick example here. If I need you to move that camera more cephalad, right, then you will know that the surgeon is saying you need to move it more towards the head, okay? So antero is referring to the front part of the body. Think anterior. Anterior is the front of the body, all right? Where caudal is tailward. Okay, pertaining to the tail or down. Cephalad, like I mentioned, is headward or upward. All right. When we use the term distal, it means pertaining to away from the point of attachment. And then proximal is the opposite of that. And we'll get to that in a second. But it seems like these are a couple terms, distal and proximal, that can be confusing, right? Distal meaning farthest away. Okay, so if we're talking about the wrist, okay, the wrist and the torso being our point of reference, and we want to know, is the wrist proximal to the elbow or is it distal to the elbow in relationship to the trunk of the body? Well, the wrist is going to be distal because it's farther away from the point of attachment where our arm attaches to our body. All right, dorsal is pertaining to the back. So dorso is the word part that we use. I think of dolphins, they have a dorsal fin. So if I can imagine the dolphin swimming along, or a shark, and that fin that's kind of sticking out of the water, then that helps me to remember that dorsal means on the back. Infero means below, and then latero means side. A couple more here for us. Medio means the middle, and then postero is another word that refers to the back. Proximo, again, is the opposite of distal, and it refers to a structure that is closest to the point of attachment. The shoulder is proximal to the elbow. All right, it's closer to the point of attachment than the elbow is. Okay, we could also say that the elbow is proximal to the wrist. Again, the point of attachment is the shoulder, and the elbow is closer to that point of attachment than our wrist is. Supero refers to above, and ventro is similar to antero, which means the belly or the front. Now, what are some suffixes we can use to work with those words? Some examples are ad, like I used the word cephalad, pertaining towards the head, okay? Towards the head. And then other suffixes like al or ic or ior, so al, ik, eor, all mean pertaining to. Cephalic, all right? Cephalic, pertaining to the head, okay? Now, here are some directional terms that they built with all of these word parts that we just talked about. And the first one is anterior, again, which means pertaining to the front. Anterolateral, however, means pertaining to the front and to the side. Remember, we start at the end with the suffix al, which means pertaining to. Then we go back to the front of the word, and antero, which means front, and lateral, which means side. Now, anteromedial means pertaining to the front and middle. Anteroposterior means pertaining to the front and the back. Anterosuperior means pertaining to the front and above. Caudad. Remember, caud means tail, and ad means toward. So caudad is towards the tail, where caudal is pertaining to the tail. And then lastly on this slide, cephalad, which we've heard before and means towards the head. A couple other terms that the book points out. Cephalic. Again, look at the ending, IC. It means pertaining to, and then we go to the front of the word and we have cephal, and that means the head. So pertaining to the head. Now distal, again, pertaining to away, whereas dorsal is pertaining to the back. Inferior, that IOR, remember that also means pertaining to, suffix meaning pertaining to. So an infero means below, so pertaining to below. Inferolateral, remember AL means pertaining to, then we go back to the front of the word, infero meaning below and latero meaning to the side, pertaining to below and to the side. Lateral, pertaining to the side. Medial, pertaining to the middle, and mediolateral, pertaining to the middle and the side. A few more here. Posterior, all right? A lot of us, well, maybe not a lot of us, but most of us have probably heard our butts referred to as our posteriors, right? That means pertaining to the back or behind, our backsides, right? Postero-anterior means pertaining to the back and to the front. Posterolateral, pertaining to the back and the side. Proximal, pertaining to near the point of attachment. Remember, I said the elbow is proximal to the wrist. Okay, the wrist is distal to the elbow. It's farther away from the point of attachment. Superior means pertaining to above, and then superolateral means pertaining to above and to the side. And then lastly, ventral means pertaining to the belly. Now, let's talk about anatomic planes. There are a few I want to cover, and the first one is known by two names, frontal and coronal. Okay, the frontal or coronal plane passes vertically through the body from side to side. So think of this, if you were to draw a line from the top of one ear over the head and stop at the top of the other ear, all right, and then imagine that line that you drew over the head going straight down through the body, dividing it into front and back halves, or anterior and posterior halves. I have an image coming up on the next slide, so stay tuned for that. Now, the sagittal plane is a vertical field running through the body from front to back. So imagine that you are drawing an imaginary line starting at your chin. You go up over the nose, up the middle of the forehead, and around the middle of the head. That imaginary line, if you imagine a plane going down through the body, is going to divide it into left and right sides. Now, sagittal can be at any point dividing any place in the body into left and right halves, but if it's smack down the middle, we call that mid-sagittal. Okay, and then the next one I want to talk about is called the transverse plane. Now you'll notice that the book also refers to it as the axial plane. Okay, so transverse, axial. You may also hear it referred to as the horizontal plane, but this is going to divide the body into upper and lower parts, or superior and inferior portions. Let's look at the graphic. So here's the graphic, and let's just start at the top with the arrow pointing to median sagittal or mid-sagittal. You can see that that sagittal plane is dividing the body into right and left halves. Now let's go down to the next one, which is the transverse plane. Remember, the transverse plane is also referred to as the axial plane or the horizontal plane, and this is going to divide the body into upper and lower portions, right? Posterior or superior and inferior portions. And then that last one is the coronal plane. And remember, the coronal plane is going to go from ear to ear. It is dividing the body into front and back portions, or we also call the coronal plane the frontal plane. Okay, some medical terms that are not built from word parts that we need to know. Umbilical. Umbilical means that it is around the navel or around the umbilicus. That is our belly button, right? The epigastric region is pertaining to the region that is above the umbilical cord, okay, or right kind of around the stomach. Hypogastric is meaning below the umbilical region or below the stomach. Okay, hypochondriac regions. No, this isn't somebody that thinks they're sick all the time, but they're really not. This refers to the right and left epigastric regions, so right below the ribs. Okay, we're getting the words. We're going to see the picture on the next slide, so hold on. The lumbar region is the right and left, to the right and to the left of the umbilical region. And then the iliac regions, we have two of those, and they're to the right and the left of the hypogastric region. So let's look at what that looks like. Okay, so here you can see two different examples. Let's start with the one on the right. Now, the one on the right, the abdomen, the abdominopelvic cavity, is divided into 4 quadrants. And you can see that they are upper and lower right quadrants and upper and lower left quadrants. And it's important for us to know what structures are located in each of those quadrants. Now, to break it down even further, we have our 9 regions that are on the left of your slide, and those 9 regions, starting with smack in the middle, is the umbilical region. Again, that is the region around the belly button, okay, or the umbilicus. Now you'll see on either right and left sides of the umbilical region are those lumbar regions. It's kind of like the lower back almost. And then if we go above that, straight above the umbilical region, you see the epigastric region, and you can see hopefully why it is called the epigastric region, because this is meaning above the stomach. But here's the stomach right here. Let me trace it out for you. All right, so you can see the stomach there, and most of that stomach is located in this epigastric region. Okay, so kind of above the stomach. The book is defining it as above the umbilicus. And then on either side of that are the left and right hypochondriac regions. Now remember, chondro means cartilage or ribs. So it helps me to think of that hypochondriac regions being kind of right by the ribs. And then let's go to the bottom. So we have the hypogastric region, which is clearly below the stomach. And then on either side, we have our left and right iliac regions, also sometimes referred to as the inguinal regions. Okay, some abbreviations that I would like to call your attention to. When we are talking about directional terms, you might see them abbreviated this way. So ANT for anterior, AP for antero-posterior, and a lot of times they use AP to when they're talking about taking x-rays. So an antero-posterior x-ray is an x-ray that is going to go front and back of a structure. All right. Lateral would be a side-to-side view. INF is how we shorten inferior. LAT is how we shorten lateral. MED is how we shorten medial. And POST is how we shorten posterior. Now, when we're talking about postero-anterior, which is the flip of front to back, this is back to front, is abbreviated PA. No, that's not Pennsylvania. And then superior, we get SUP, and then the four last ones are referring to those four quadrants that I spoke of on the previous slide, where you have RUQ, standing for right upper quadrant, LUQ, left upper quadrant, RLQ, right lower quadrant, and LLQ is left lower quadrant. Now, the book does briefly mention some positions, and if you're in your textbook, that's on page 39. It talks about the Fowler's position, which is kind of a semi-sitting position. A lot of times we'll refer to this as the beach chair position. So if you can think of someone or yourself lounging in a beach chair, not completely sitting upright, but kind of lounging back, that would be the Fowler's position. The orthopnea position is the sitting upright position, and sometimes we take blood pressures laying down and standing up, and you might hear this for the blood pressure that we take when somebody is sitting up, right? The prone position, that's going to be when someone's on their bellies, all right? They're laying face down. Now, the Sims position refers to a lateral position or side lying position, all right? And then the supine position means laying on our backs, okay, looking up at the ceiling. And then the last one that the book talks about is Trendelenburg. And Trendelenburg is the position where it's a modified supine position where the patient is laying on their back, but the table is tilted so that the head is lower than the feet. All right, they're still lying flat, but the top of the bed gets moved in a way where the head is below the feet. Now, the opposite of that is something called reverse Trendelenburg, and that is where the bed is tilted so that the head is above the feet. Now, this is helpful in several situations, but specifically related to surgery. If we are working on an organ that is in the right upper quadrant, it is often helpful to let gravity assist with our exposure of that organ. And so the surgeon might ask for the patient to be put in a reverse Trendelenburg so that it shifts some of those other internal organs down and away from the area that we're working. And the same could be true if we're working in the pelvis on the bladder or the uterus, let's say. The Trendelenburg position would help to shift the abdominal contents headward, right, cephalic, and that would also help us with our exposure. Okay, So that brings us to the end of our first lesson. I hope that you found it was helpful. Practice, practice, practice. That's the best way for you to learn this new language. Also, I would highly encourage you to do the online reviews that accompany your textbook. So again, in the very front cover, there should be instructions to guide you to get to those online resources. So use those. Those would be very helpful as well. And thank you for listening.